Good evening. Let's go. Let's make a start. Lots to get through. Vayeira is a long Parsha. It is. Oh, is it? Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, what I'd like to do is talk about several different aspects of the Parsha. The truth is, we're going to mainly more focus towards the end of the Parsha rather than the beginning. Just because there's so many Vayeira, there's so much obviously to do, but we'll try and cover as much as we can. The Rashi, beginning of the Parsha, Yudches Pasuk Gimel, brings the idea, the concept of Hachnosas Orchim, and says, one second, very famous Rashi, the Dova Acha, the second explanation, the second pshat in Rashi and Pasuk Gimel, the beginning of the Parsha, right? Dova Acha, Kodeshu, that is this, when it says Vayomar, next word is Hashem's name, according to the second explanation of Rashi. Al no savam yalavdecha, don't move away. He's saying to Hashem, don't move away. That he should, until he is able to run and to bring in the guests. And even though it says afterwards, this the actual statement, the statement was beforehand. So here we have the very famous concept, the idea, as the Medrash says, that Gedola Hachnosas Orchim Yosef Mekabola Pnei Shechina. The idea that the concept of receiving guests, if you like, is greater. Hachnosas Orchim is greater. A welcome is greater than receiving the Pnei Shechina, which is a remarkable thing. The idea that should be greater. So the Vilna Gaon has a pshat to explain that, which we'll come back to in a second. But just there is a piece in the which is actually brought in the Encyclopedia Talmudis, so it's nice to quote that because he's coming also to show us a little bit of a flyer there for Steinberg. Should be a fantastic event. But he points out something which is relatively straightforward. I don't know if it was him because it was written by many people over many decades. But there is a piece there that I saw quoted where he brings together the Achronim say how we learn all the halachas. All the halachas of Hachnosas Orchim from Avram Avinu. Everything he does teaches us another aspect of these halachas, right? Number one, Vayoratz Likros. You've got to go looking for them. You've got to run after them. You've got to find them. Number two, you've got to make sure that you give them everything they need. Right? You give them a bit of water, everything they need to wash their feet, whatever it is they need, right? Give them a place that they should be comfortable. Make sure that they're comfortable in terms of where they are. The idea of to say little and do much, right? What does Avraham Avinu say? I'm going to bit of bread, and what does he end up with? A massive suda, right? The Reich Kiddush, exactly. He says another. You see that the idea that when it comes to this mitzvah, there's a special idea to educate one's family. He runs to the tent. He tells sorry, right, and he gets the whole family involved. Right, mitzvahs. Okay, so in other words, all of the different aspects. If you go through this whole parsha, you see every different idea and every different part of the facet of this mitzvah is encapsulated within this parsha. The beauty of it and the way it can educate one's entire family. Now, the question is asked by the Vilna Gaon in Kol Eliyahu says that though people ask, how do you see that the mitzvah of Hachnosas Orchim is greater than receiving the divine presence? How do you see it's greater? Maybe they're equal. How do you see that in fact it's greater from this parsha? And he says that there is a halacha that you have to face when a person is leaving one's rebbe, one's teacher. You have to walk. There's an idea of walking backwards. Ponav klape rabbi, walk backwards, right? What's the idea? Chazal say, base this on the posuk in Parshas Vayeira, where it says Vayifan Vayisim in Paro, the way he left Paro. So here he says, when the Malachim walked away from Avram Avinu, they would have walked that backwards because they were treating him in that respect. Avram, when he sees the guests, what does he do? He goes to receive them. and he asks Hashem, so to speak, to wait for him until he receives the guests.
How do we see that he waits? Where does it say that he waits for Hashem? He asks Hashem to wait?
No, because according to the second Pshat in Rashi, he says Al Nosa Avar Mi Alavdecha is speaking to Hashem. Don't move away. Wait for me whilst I go to receive the guests, and I'll come back to you. That's the two Pshat in Rashi. The first Pshat in Rashi is that the second word of Pasuk Gimel is directed to the Malachim, the first Pshat, right? In other words, he's saying to them, don't move, stay here. I want guests. Right, that's the simple pshat in the pasuk. The second pshat in the pasuk is Hashem's name, and he says, "Al no sava." If I found favor in your eyes, please wait while I deal with the orachim, with the guests. That's the second pshat, right? Now, when he leaves Hashem's presence, so to speak, he should have been facing. Okay, he should have obviously walked backwards. He's facing Hashem, right, and not to face the guests, right? But it's not derech eretz to receive guests in that way. And therefore, it says, Vayoratz likrosom. He saw and he ran towards them, which implies, right? And the Vilna Gaon says you can't run backwards. I mean, you can try, but you'd fall over, right? You can't run. It's an interesting thing. It's physically impossible to run backwards. You can walk very fast backwards, then you can run backwards. So he must be that Vayoratz must be turned round. So there you see that it must be that receiving guests is greater than Kabbalah's Pnei Ashchina, because he actually turned around and faced them, even though normally, of course, you would walk backwards when leaving the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you see from here another aspect, beautiful aspect, representation of the Chesed and of Avraham Avinu in the context of Hachnosas Archim. So, but there is a paradox here with the end of the parsha, and when you look at it, the two things together. It's really when you consider it in the two parshas together, it really strikes you, and that is Avraham Avinu here goes to tremendous lengths to bring people into his home, people he doesn't know, but they're archim, they're guests, yeah. And what is he faced with in the according to some the penultimate test? Driving people away who are very close to him, right? Hagar and Yishmael. So it's the entire opposite. He's forced to do something which is the exact opposite. It's against everything he knows, everything he does, his nature in every way. He's forced to drive away those who are closest to him. And Rav Dessler in Mechtav Meliol goes through this and explains that we learn very, very important lessons about the concept of chesed from here, right? There's a medrash he quotes which says that of all the things that Avraham Avinu, all the misfortunes that Avraham Avinu is faced with in his life, this was the worst for him personally. Very interesting. Normally we learn the Akedah was the hardest, was the worst. But on a personal level, this was the hardest one, the Medrash says, because he had to drive away Hagar and Yishmael. And that was an incredibly difficult thing for him to do, right? Now, the idea, says Rav Dessler, is that Avraham Avinu is given many tests. He's the greatest Baal Chesed, but he has to show Gevurah. Even though his midah is chesed, right? And a Baal Chesed by nature is always tremendously giving, outgoing, forgiving, overlooking. That's the nature of a Baal Chesed. Yet he has to show the midah of Gevurah, and he's tested in that way. The idea of having to show strength, which is almost like the opposite. We know Yitzchak represents Gevurah. That's a different for another time. But the point is, Avraham Avinu is tested in this way, which is a fascinating idea, right? And Rav Dessler says that the test for Avraham Avinu was the fact that he still loved Yishmael, and he was tested in such a way that he had to show Gevurah. And not only did he overcome the test, but he demonstrated the manner in which he overcame it was against everything in his own personal nature. If you look at what the Pasuk says, let's find, one second, it is, one second. Vayashkem Avraham Baboker. Pasuk Yudala. Chof Aleph Pasuk Yudala. Vayashkem Avraham Baboker. Avraham gets up very early in the morning, right? There's no hesitation, okay? And what does he give her? Vayikach lechem v'chimas mayim. Hold on a second. Where's the Ben HaBokar and the the shonas bachardo, the tongues in mustard and the cream, meat and milk. That's the shiur after Shabbos. Whatever. I have to give other plugs for other things. But anything. You would think that of all he does that for strangers. The least he can do for her is send her away with a decent packed lunch. But he doesn't do that. He gives lechem and chemas mayim. You understand? You're looking at this is looking at the psukim and noticing. Pardon? What?
Bread and water.
No, he didn't. He said that, but then ended up giving much more. That's the point. We learn hachnosas archim is say a little and do a lot. So in other words, you invite someone to your house. It's very bad. You invite someone to your house and say, it's okay, I'm not going to go to great trouble. It's okay. And then you really do. You didn't tell them. You tell them, we're just having something small. And then you light lunch. And then that's how it is. But it's an amazing thing. Here, Avraham Avinu, it's so much, it's completely against everything, his whole nature. You would expect him to go to town. If he has to send her away, he would delay. He'd do it at the last possible moment. He'd do it late in the day, and he'd send her with loads of food. And he doesn't do that. Why? Because this was the test. He had to overcome this test. He had to show him Midov Gevurah. And even though he was unwell, but he had to do it immediately. Avraham Avinu had to send it away immediately, right? She wandered. Vatelech vatesa. The end of the pasuk of Midbar be'er shava. Where Rav Dessler understands it, every line in this pasuk is Avraham Avinu overcoming the test. Do you understand? He's getting up early in the morning. He's giving her bread and water. Vatelech vatesa b'midbar be'er shava. She's wandering around. She's wondering for no one to guide her. So every part of that pasuk is a new understanding. Are you with me? That's the test. That's the overcoming the test. The fact that he has to conduct it in this manner. What's the message? Says Rav Dessler, the test for Avraham Avinu is to be in control of his emotions, is not to allow his natural sense of being a Baal Chesed to take over, so that he can potentially be misguided. If the mitzvah is to banish her, that's the mitzvah, however difficult it may be to do. And the fact that the lesson that's taught for his descendants, as in Maisa Ovasim Labonim, is that even Chesed has its limitations. And if you become, we all should be tremendous Ba'alei Chesed. But if we don't have limitations on our Chesed, it is possible that Chesed is applied in the wrong way. A person can be a tremendous Ba'al Chesed and always want to do kindness to others. And unfortunately, that means they could break boundaries. They could behave in an inappropriate way, or they could do chesed when you shouldn't show chesed. Not everyone. There are certain circumstances where it's not good for the person to show. All sorts of contexts where chesed has to be bounded in the right way. Here, for example, is the classic example. It would be ostensibly, of course, he should keep him in his household, but the truth was that wasn't chesed, because it was a negative influence in the house. It needed to be. He could not be there with Yitzchak. At the end of the day, Avraham Avinu was assured that he knew that he would become a great nation. So he knew that wasn't the end of the story for Yishmael. There was a measure of comfort there for him, right? But he had to follow Hashem's will in this way. And then Rav Dessler goes to the next Parsha, the very brief Parsha about Avimelech and the pact with Avimelech. And the question is, what is the significance of the fact Vayhi bo'es hahi, that Parsha which is sandwiched between the sending away of Hagar and Yishmael and the Akedah? This brief Parsha, which whenever we learn, especially when it's very prominent on Rosh Hashanah, it almost seems out of place. This little Parsha that goes between those two major events of the sending away of Yishmael and the Akedah, there's a little treatise he makes of Avimelech. Why is that significant? And why is it Vayhi bo'es hahi at that specific time? Posach Chof Beis, Perek Chof Aleph, Posach Chof Beis. Says Rav Dessler like this: Avram is the master of Chesed. He loves peace, everything. He pursues it in every way. But at that time, and specifically at that time, he has to act with that severity of sending away Hagar and Yishmael. He is able to be besimcha at making a sense and a pact of peace. It's almost like a reassurance to him. Again, it's all about balance. He's had to overcome and demonstrate the midah of Gevurah by sending away Hagar and Yishmael, but he's comforted with the fact that he can almost like return to his essence and his nature by signing a pact of peace with the locals, right? Which is very much part of his natural path, if you like, in that way. However, he says that that Rav Dessler carries on to say that if you look at Chazal say there's actually some criticism. There is a criticism of Avraham, and it's quoted in the Rashbam. Let's see if we can find it. A second. Yeah, if it's the Rashbam is on Pasuk Lamed, so in the middle of the parsha. If you've got a Mikras Gedolos, it's in there. If not, but it's in Mikras Gedolos is on Pasuk Lamed, and it says he makes this covenant. There's 7, and there were 7 sheep involved. Yeah, Sheva Kavosos Tikach Miodi Bavoti Elila Edok Yichvat Yesaberazos. There's this pact over the well, and it's all in right. And it's all agreed. They made a bris b've'er shava. The Rashbam says, Omalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Atona Satoli Sheva Kavosos. You have given to me 7 sheep. Chayecha Shebonov Osem Sheva Shebonov. Right? Sorry. You've given him 7 sheep for this pact. Okay. Chayecha, by your life, Shebonov Osim Sheva Milchomis in Bonecha, that his descendants will make 7 wars with your children for Notzchenoson, and they will be victorious over them. And then there's another pshat. Bonov Horagim Shevat Tzadikim. His children will kill 7 Tzadikim from your descendants, and he gives the list: Shimshon, Chofni, Pinchas, Shol. All the interaction that if you learn Nach, there's a tremendous amount of negative interaction with the Plishtim. That's the whole, right? It's all there, right? Says the Rashbam, it all came from this parsha. It all came from this parsha, right? All those episodes of Shimshon and all the things that went on, right? It all came from here. And then he gives another pshat. He says that his descendants will destroy 7 mishkanos, right? Like as in the Mishkan and later the Beis Hamikdash, the Oyel Moed, the Gil, etc., right? So the idea is, says Rav Dessler, that what Chazal are telling us here with Ruach HaKodesh is that because, again, in the middle of Emes, there perhaps was here a slight excess in Chesed. In Avraham Avinu's desire to make that pact with the Plishtim, there was something a bit more. At the end of the day, who was Avimelech? He was an Oved Avodah Zarah. He was an idolatrous local king, and he was occupying the territory promised to Avraham Avinu. Let's be clear, what's going on here, right? Where does he live? He's in Eretz Canaan. It's this part of Avraham Avinu's land. Hashem has promised this land to Avraham, and he makes this pact. And in some way, says Rav Dessler, maybe he was in that way. There was a certain, it had a future effect, as Chazal say, that there would be a need for future battles in conquering the land as a result, and maybe they needed to atone in some way for this very slight defect, as he puts it, in this midah of chesed. And again, it's the same idea, therefore, that all midas need to be conducted in exactly the right way. It's a very difficult thing to do. One second. Yeah. After the account of the pact with Avimelech, right? What do we have then? We have the Akedah. Okay. And again, there's a link. Achar hadvarim ha'ela. Yeah. Yeah. Next parsha. Chav Beis Aleph. Right. Achar hadvarim ha'ela. What's the connection? Okay. What's the connection? Again, another Rashbam. Dessler brings the Rashbam. The Rashbam says that on this pasuk, it's always connected. Achar hadvarim ha'ela. He says, one second. What's it? Which one is it? 1 second. Yeah. No. So he gives lots of examples. Sorry, he gives lots of examples. If you go through later on, he says, Afkan. It's about a few lines into it. Achad Varim shekoras Avram bris Avimelech. After he made the pact with Avimelech, right? So he gave him all the sheep. Hashem was upset about that. Okay, and therefore, as a result, you have right the Avraham. Hashem tested Avraham Avinu. Right? Again, why? Because there was a need to rectify this slight over exuberance of chesed in that way, right? And therefore, we have the Akedah. It's forced to be in exactly the right measure, because Hashem says you're going to have to bring Yitzchak. You have to bring Yitzchak onto the Mizbeach. Now, to understand, we'll spend the remaining time on that. Let's focus on the Akedah. Rav Shach in his Seif Machshavas Musa, which brings together different ideas of Rav Shach on the Torah, taken, I think, from his drashas, etc., in Fonovich. So he says that that what we have to understand from the Parsha, particularly from the Parsha of the Akedah, is we have to understand it in the context of the fact that it's the final test, and the fact that it helps understand two fundamental points. The two fundamental points that are taught through the Akedah, he says, is number one, that there is no such thing as a contradiction in this world. There are no steers in creation. There are no contradictions in creation. And if we cannot see how to resolve contradictions, then we need to accept that that fault is with us and not with Hashem and the way the world is created. And he says, how do you see this from the Parsha? So he says the whole world, from the beginning of creation, you see, and he goes through this in great detail, that everything is balanced. Everything about creation is about balance. Everything is entirely balanced. The world is entirely balanced in every way, the natural world, to the extent that, as quite famously, if the world itself wasn't positioned in exactly the place it is, right, the Goldilocks idea, yeah, it would not be possible for life to be extant in this world, to exist. That's why there is only life on this planet, as far as we know. And that's how it is, and that's how the world exists in entire balance. So he says, when you look at the natural world and you see the fact that everything is precisely balanced, when we have in our lives, in any respect, some sort of contradiction, questions, a stira, this doesn't make sense, I don't understand how this happens, how this can happen, why this happened, etc., right? How we have two possible pathways of thought. Number one is that we turn to Hashem and say, how could you do this? But he says, you've got to look at the world, and you've got to say the world itself is precisely balanced. And if the world is precisely balanced, then surely it's not to do with the way Hashem, it must be, this is also balanced. It must be what is happening is also precisely balanced from the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if there's something that I don't understand, it's because of me. The fault is with me rather than with the way Hashem has set the world to be.
Hashem's perspective is infinite, but there's ours.
Exactly, but that's the 100%. Exactly. But the question is, how do you see this in the Akedah? What is it about the Akedah that does this? So he brings the Medrash, which says with the Akedah, famously it says, right? He says to stay with the donkey, and I and my now will go up to here, right? What does it mean? And Chazal say, what does it mean to stay in Machamor with a donkey? The people who are compared to a donkey. In other words, the idea that only that they are not part of Klal Yisrael, and they are avodim, etc., servants, etc. Why has it got to do with the Akedah? Why is it here that this idea is it has to be expressed? There's like Am Hadom El Chamor, right? The people who are like a donkey. Why is that being stressed specifically in the context of the Akedah? So he says, when Avraham Avinu went to perform the Akedah, he had a tremendous contradiction, so to speak, within himself. Hashem has promised him, right? I promise your descendants will be like the dust of the land. There is no other son other than Yitzchak. And how will that be fulfilled? Okay? And he was concerned that perhaps I will be. He sort of went through the process, if you like, that he might be comforted by the fact that he's still got Yishmael. And that's why he immediately says, right? And that's why the emphasis is stay with the donkey. No, because you are not going to fulfill that for me. It's not possible for you to fulfill that, because in that respect, it's only Yitzchak who can fulfill that. So he walks away with that intense contradiction within himself, that I've been promised the land, yet I'm going to lose Yitzchak. So how can I live with that contradiction? The contradiction itself is impossible, is unfathomable for me to understand, right? And therefore he says, yes, it says Hashem is Abraham. He didn't know it was a test afterwards, of course not. It was not a test. Otherwise, not a test, right? Of course. He says that the idea is that he had to accept within himself that both these ideas would somehow be true, even though they were a complete contradiction in terms. Even though what he was doing and what he was asked to do was a complete contradiction to the notion of your descendants will inherit you, but at the same time, he had to make sure he had to follow that pathway. And therefore the message is of the Akedah, Va'ani v'hanan el chad ko, right? And Rashi brings there, when it says he says, you stay here, and I and the Nar, Nel Chad Ko, will go to here, then the Adan will come back to you. Ere, Rashi says, Medrash Agoda, Ere, I will see, I will see, where is it that Hashem, where is the promise of Hashem, who said to me, Ko Yezarecha, this is what your children will be like. What does that mean? That's emphasizing the contradiction, it would seem. The Rav Shach says, he was going along saying that. I will see, let me see. I'm completely in your hands, Hashem. For as far as I can see it, it doesn't make sense. I don't understand how I will ever see Ko Yezarecha. And yet, I know that somehow that will happen, somehow, because there cannot be a contradiction. And just like the world itself would not exist if it wasn't balanced in this way, and there are no contradictions in the world, in the whole Bria, so too here, somehow, there will be no contradiction ultimately, and ultimately Hashem will fulfill it in some way. In other words, that is the test. The test is he able to accept the fact that Hashem's master plan governs everything, even when it appears to us to be a complete contradiction? That's the first point Rav Shach says. The second fundamental idea he says that you see in the test of the Akedah is the idea that he brings a medrash. Again, there's a fascinating thing. You have to understand that the Soton, there's a running theme in the Akedah with the Soton. You know that. You look through the midrashim of the Akedah, and he appears multiple times. And of course, the parallel is with Eov, right? When the Soton comes to you, this is expressed explicitly at the beginning of Sefer Eov, and the Soton comes to Hashem and says, yeah, have you seen your servant? Yeah, let me test him, right? And the Gemara in Bava Basra goes through that whole dialogue. Says basically, Avram Avinu is not necessarily great as Avram Avinu. There's this parallel between Eov and Avram Avinu, and Eov, the Soton asks to test Eov, right? And also the Soton is very much involved in the testing of Avram, even though it's Avram being tested directly, obviously by Hashem, right? It's all, how you understand the role of the Soton. The Gemara says that who's Soton, who Malacham, obviously Yetzirah. It's all one and the same thing. The Soton and the Malacham, obviously the Yetzirah. But anyway, the appearance of the Soton is very, very central in the Midrashim on the Akedah. One of those Midrashim says that when Avram Avinu went to shecht his son, the Soton came in front of him to test him. And he said like this, Saba, Saba. I called him Saba, elderly man. Ovada tolibcha. You lost your mind. You've lost your mind. Ben shenitzen l'chol me'er shon. The son that was given to you at the age of 100, you're going to shecht him. The Medrash says there was dialogue between the son and the wrong. What are you doing? You're mad. Amalei said to him, Al munoske, on this condition. It's a very strange dialogue. What does it mean, Al munoske, on condition of this? Says Rav Shach, just to summarize briefly what he says. The Soton says that Hashem has given you this son, and you're going to shecht him, right? The problem is, it's obvious. This in the Soton's question, right? Ben shenitzan lecha, right? Lemei shana. The son that was given to you at the age of 100, when you're 100 years old, you're going to shecht him. So the Soton himself knows that Hashem has given that child to Avram Avinu, and Hashem has commanded him what to do. So what is the question? Why, what question is he throwing at Avram Avinu? He himself recognizes this son was a gift from Hashem, and therefore Hashem is following Hashem's command by telling him where to go. Says says Rav Shach like this. Right? He says that if it was true, Avram says to the Soton, that everything we do or are commanded to do has to accord with our own intellectual understanding. If we have to understand everything in this world, you're correct. I'm crazy. I'm a crazy elderly man, right? If it's true that everything has to work, has to be logical, we have to understand everything. You're right, then I've lost my mind. But he said to him, the opposite is true. The reality is that my seichel says I don't understand, right? But because I know that everything Hashem does is perfect, Hatsur Tomim Palo, whatever Hashem does is perfect, The fact that I don't understand is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. It's not relevant. It's not relevant. Hashem has told me to do this. This is the way. This is the command of Hashem. This is the command of Hashem, right? The lesson of the final test is that you don't need to understand. Is that you don't need to understand. Is that you cannot understand everything. That's the final message. You don't need to always understand the test. You don't need to always understand. You don't need to come to a place where you've balanced everything in your mind, where you've been where you're rationally able to make everything square, make everything neat in your life. No, you don't have to do that always. Sometimes you cannot do that. And that is why he responds to Sota Amanos Kenet on condition, this is why I've done this, because Hashem has told me to do it. You know, I don't have an understanding. And you're right, ostensibly, it looks like it, but there's no contradiction. Because ultimately, to pass this test means Ein Sorech Lahavin. You don't need to understand. You don't need to understand. So that's why it's the hardest test of all, because there's no rationale. There is no way of rationalizing it fundamentally in terms of what the Akedah itself is. So these are just a lot of ideas. But a lot of ideas. I think we're out of time, but yeah, always more for the Parshas Vayeira, every Parsha. Thanks for joining. Thank you all for coming.
Sure,
Have a
thank
good
you.
Shabbos.
Sure, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Good Shabbos.